Okay, so now we're going to go to the Department of Justice. So the Department of Justice under Project 2025 has gotten a lot of attention, primarily because there is an overemphasis on qualified immunity. And what qualified immunity basically means is that law enforcement officers who commit actions usually surrounding aggravated assault or severe bodily harm or even homicide have immunity from criminal prosecution of those acts if those acts were committed in the line of duty. So the belief is that the only reason why a law enforcement officer would use extreme force, including causing severe bodily injury or even death, is because the circumstances warranted it, and therefore they should not be penalized in a court because of this. Those of us who understand the history of police brutality in the United States understand that that is extremely scary, and it is extremely risky to populations that are over-policed, including Black, Latino, immigrant, and poor white communities. Stay tuned, we got more. Jumping right in. According to the Heritage Foundation, a study revealed that about 47% of Americans felt that the Department of Justice is too political, corrupt, and not to be trusted. Well, this is interesting because we also have a Department of Justice with a very sketchy history of not policing crimes that were pretty horrible crimes and corruption within local law enforcement ranks. So what the Heritage Foundation wants to do with this is a couple of things, and I'm going to try to sum it up so that we can get a better idea of what this is talking about. Number one, there are certain departments that fall under the DOJ. One of them is the FBI. So according to the Heritage Foundation, the FBI has become so political, aligning with the left, as they say, the woke left, or woke leftism, or wokeism. They use woke in this document more than the dictionary, probably. But the one thing that they want to focus on is that the FBI investigating claims of collusion with foreign governments in our recent elections was a hoax, and it was fraud, and it wasn't fraud, and it was false, and that the only reason why the FBI investigated all of that is because they align with the Democrats, as they say. So what they really want in Project 2025 is to completely gut the FBI. To gut the FBI of its power and its influence. And to only use the FBI personnel on cases and concerns that the president's office, the executive office, finds important. Hold that thought. The next thing is that there is this overemphasis on peaceful protesters who are being treated like terrorists, and the classification of domestic terrorism. Because according to the Heritage Foundation, the only terrorists can be foreign, and people who, bomb abortion clinics or disrupt school board meetings or threaten to do whatever, to school board representatives because they don't like the fact that, hey, trans non-binary kids can actually use the pronoun they. And these individuals react in violent ways. Let me just read what they say. They felt that the DOJ stopped the free speech and rights of parents to engage in just speaking up to school boards about their concerns. So let's read this. The DOJ engaged in conduct to chill the free speech of parents. First of all, chill the free speech. But when people protested George Floyd, that wasn't free speech. That was terrorism. Stay with me because it's all over the place, okay? So the terrorists, first, there's no domestic terrorists. All terrorists are foreign, except for people who are protesting police brutality, racial injustice. Those are terrorists. Let's get back to this. The DOJ engaged in conduct to chill the free speech rights of parents across the United States in response to supposed threats against school boards. Actually, those were not supposed threats. There are documented threats made against school boards in several states, simply because they wanted to allow children to have freedom of gender identity, or they wanted to teach critical race theory. I'll be back. The other thing too is this emphasis on misinformation and disinformation, and that the FBI have become agents to censor and monitor social media and to punish the thoughts, the free thought of good Americans, and call it misinformation and disinformation. So, that's because it is. Misinformation and disinformation propagated by social media is what led to the groundswell of protests against the last presidential administration change of power. The department has devoted unprecedented resources to prosecuting Americans for misdemeanor trespassing offenses. And the violation of the FACE Act. The FACE Act basically states that hospitals are protected spaces. They're protected spaces. You just can't run into a hospital and harm people. But then they also say that they're just protesting. They're not really doing anything wrong. But they're being prosecuted as if they've done horrible things. Yet, wait, there's more. The protesters of the groundswell of protests surrounding the murder of George Floyd and others resulted in no criminal prosecution. And according to them, this is all Antifa. So stay tuned. Furthermore, the idea is that the liberals can violate federal laws and nothing happens to them. But the good American conservatives do things like harass patients seeking abortion care, threaten school board members. Well, those are just Americans exercising their constitutional right to assembly and protest. We got more. Next, this idea of election fraud. there have been over 20 state, and this doesn't include the local cases, around the country that have been filed alleging election fraud in our last presidential election. 0 convictions. But what has happened is that many of the players who were involved in that, like most notably in Georgia, when the Secretary of State was called by the former president and a pundit and basically told, hey, find some votes for us. Go find some. But that's not considered election fraud. Next, they want to talk about fentanyl and that it's all coming through the border. We need to close down the borders because one border. Let's be clear about that. And there's a whole lot of xenophobic threats about the boogeyman abroad. We have watched this kind of rhetoric before. This type of rhetoric is what led to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, for instance. And then finally, we have to enforce our immigration laws because the immigration laws are the problem. Those are the problem. And in enforcing immigration laws, that also includes detaining innocent migrants who are simply escaping atrocities in their home countries. Yeah, it gets better. So according to Project 2025, it is essential that the next conservative administration place a high priority on reforming the DOJ and its culture. Because again, according to the Heritage Foundation, the only people that the DOJ is prosecuting are people who are harassing school board members, blowing up health clinics, and committing election fraud by attempting to address election fraud. Let's continue. So we need to just gut the DOJ, reform it, get rid of it. And this FBI, because we have a whole lot of agents in the FBI that are actually really smart people, they need to get on board with the new administration's goals. And those are the cases that they are about to just spend all their time on. So very different than what we've had before, where people there's a process to report to the Department of Justice. Now, everything needs to come. The marching orders come from the president. All the field offices are now controlled by the local, governments. And we know what that looks like when you basically have people from the community, people who are embedded in the same corruption, now working as the last stop of justice in a state. What could possibly go wrong with that? So instead of it being centralized, now it's going to be, the FBI is now going to be peppered among field offices. And the DOJ is just going to be a repository to make sure that, people are doing what the president wants them to do. So instead of the Department of Justice working for the people, the Department of Justice will work for the conservative president. What could possibly go wrong with that? The other thing, too, with the Department of Justice that became very clear is that it almost bastardized law enforcement. A critical component of law enforcement investigation is the idea that it is apolitical, that you are looking at the evidence and you are making a decision based on the evidence and the rule of law. However, according to the Heritage Foundation, decisions should be made based on the administration's goals and something about the rule of law. Let's continue. There's this idea that we are now going to get rid of the term domestic terrorists. Because according to the Heritage Foundation, political leaders can call citizens domestic terrorists, right? Because the individuals who stormed the Capitol building, resulting in several deaths, including law enforcement officers, were just American citizens, just, exercising their constitutional rights. Yet when American citizens also exercised their constitutional rights to protest, they were considered thugs, unruly, and required military force to disperse them. The other thing, too, that is clear here is the double standard when it comes to protests and exercising the right to protest. In that, if you align with conservative values, you are simply an American exercising your constitutional right to protest. If you do not align with the conservative agenda, you are unruly and violent, and you need to be taken care of to the degree of deadly force, of which the law enforcement officers who implement that will not face penalty, and there will be no oversight from the Department of Justice, because everything will just go to field offices where they will die. The other thing, too, there is this emphasis on FACE cases, and once again, FACE this was a federal act that prohibited certain types of protest and menacing, threatening activities inside of clinical spaces, right? So this is what they stated. The FBI harassed protesting parents while working diligently to shut down politically disfavored speech on the pretext of it being disinformation and misinformation, while ignoring dozens of violent attacks on pregnancy care centers. Where? Because I looked at a couple and I couldn't really find any. But what I did find is dozens of abortion centers targeted by threats of bombings, by actual bombings. We have an ugly history of abortion providers wearing bulletproof vests, of people lying about being pregnant just to get access into an abortion clinic to carry out terrorist attacks. That we do have. But according to Project 2025, the Department of Justice should not focus on that, because those are just good old Americans exercising their right to I don't know what. In a nutshell, under Project 2025, the Department of Justice focus should be on violent crime. And that is a very interesting distinction to be made, because there are lots of crimes that are not physically violent. Violent crime has a very specific definition. Usually it is a crime against the person. There's a perpetrator and there's a victim. There's some degree of bodily harm or injury. So when we think about violent crimes, we think of things such as assault, battery, rape, aggravated sodomy, homicide. Those are all violent crimes. According to the FBI uniform crime statistics, that classification of crime is kind of the minority of crimes that happen. There's a lot of other crimes that happen, such as property crimes, such as financial crimes, such as fraud. We don't need to talk about those crimes. We need to just talk about these crimes. The other thing is that there is a huge focus around international terrorists, drug trafficking, this kind of pot of violent crime, and nothing else. And that's pretty scary for me. It's pretty scary. Also, this idea that immigration is a threat to national security and needs to be the overall focus or primary focus of the Department of Justice is absolutely abhorrent. While we do have an influx of migrants into our country, majority of these individuals are not committing crimes. This idea that groves of South American gangs are coming through American cities and just wreaking havoc on the community is an urban legend. It is an urban legend, and as someone who lives in the south side of Chicago, let me tell you, I would literally be in the epicenter of this, and I'm not seeing it. Next, the way the Department of Justice wants to handle civil rights is absolutely abhorrent, and basically they want to gut the Civil Rights Act and they want to just flip it on its head. And we're going to talk more about that. And I'm going to introduce a term called DARVO that I think is going to be very applicable here. So before I get to this next statement on the Department of Justice, I want to introduce a term called DARVO. Deny, attack, and reverse the victim and offender. It is often used in spaces involving domestic abuse, where assailants of domestic violence will take the behaviors of a target, flip them around, and make themselves the victim. It is crazy making, and it is intended to be confusing and to re-victimize the true victim. One of the things that is happening with the Department of Justice, and I've stated this in other departments, is that the offices of civil rights of several departments, the Department of Labor, the Department of Education, the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Health and Human Services, the Department of the Environmental Protection Agency, they're all coming to the Department of Justice. So the Department of Civil Rights will be here. But then the other thing too is that the Department of Civil Rights is getting rid of all those diversity, equity programs, because you know what they do? They discriminate. They offer preferential treatments to minority, LGBTQA plus people. They talk about things like gender diversity. They talk about things like, equity, inclusion. And by definition, these terms are discriminatory. Are you guys following me here? Equity, inclusion, diversity, gender, identity, agency. According to Project 2025, these terms are the antithesis of civil rights violations. Therefore, they will be prosecuted by the DOJ to the highest extent of the law through the Department of Civil Rights that will be housed in the DOJ. So yes, if your school is attempting to address disparities based on race, that is a violation of civil rights. If your job is attempting to make sure that there is diversity in hiring practices, that is a violation of civil rights. That is insane. So let's wrap up the Department of Justice. Of no surprise to anyone, there is an overwhelming focus to get rid of qualified immunity for officers. Basically, they will have immunity across the board. According to Project 2025, most people who are victims of police brutality are actual criminals, and oh well, they had to do their job. Next, this idea that the FBI will literally just become hitman for the presidential administration based on whatever priorities the president and the executive office thinks are priorities, will mean that the FBI would not be working on behest of the people, but will literally just be soldiers for the administration, and that the FBI will be decentralized into regional offices around the country, and the hiring will come from the local communities. What could possibly go wrong with that? Next, the idea that violent crime, which is a minority of all crimes, and immigration is going to be the focus of the Department of Justice, is mind-numbing. Regarding the term domestic terrorism, that term is actually discriminatory against law-abiding American citizens who want to protest abortion clinics and threaten school board members, even if these people do so with firearms, which are legally obtained because they have the Second Amendment right to carry arms. Furthermore, the idea that peaceful protesters or protesters who do not align with conservative values need to be punished, stopped, and prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, including military grade force, because those are the true terrorists. So we can't use the term domestic terrorist, but then we treat people who don't agree with this as if they are. And lastly, this idea that elected officials, district attorneys, who may not see crimes in individuals protesting police brutality are not being indicted, should be investigated. Because part of this is saying that district attorneys like Fannie Lewis So let's wrap this up. Essentially, the Department of Justice will become decentralized within its ranks. The FBI will no longer be centrally housed there, and it will be decentralized among field offices around the country. And field offices will consist of people from the local communities. So essentially, you'll just have a federal link to the local law enforcement. So the people who would potentially investigate law enforcement corruption in local precincts are actually living in the precinct. Finally, the FBI will lose a great deal of its investigative powers and will only be assigned cases based on the current administration's priorities. The other thing too is the use of the term domestic terrorist is going to be kind of phased out, because domestic terrorists who are also conservative leaning are viewed as law-abiding citizens who are exercising their constitutional rights to protest, even if these constitutional rights include bringing firearms into hospitals and abortion clinics and harassing school board members. On the flip side, if protesting is more liberal leaning, then those individuals require military grade force to disperse them, and they should be prosecuted to the highest extent of the law. And if local district attorneys are not prosecuting them, then the Department of Justice steps in and makes sure that those district attorneys are held accountable. Next, the idea that the Office of Civil Rights will literally just be a judicial graveyard, and the bastardization of the term civil rights to mean any type of preferential treatment given to groups based on discriminated class is now considered discrimination. I told you it was mind-numbing, right? In addition, this idea that the FBI's focus on misinformation and disinformation should stop, because diversity of thought, including social media, should be allowed. Because disinformation and misinformation has never manifested itself into real violence. That's sarcasm, it has. Furthermore, the idea that the emphasis should only be on violent crimes and immigration and election fraud and punishing violators of the Civil Rights Act, meaning people who were originally the targeted groups of the Civil Rights Act, and of course punishing doctors and women who seek abortion. That should only be the focus of the Department of Justice. And the FBI, once again, is going back to local offices, and, they'll deal with it down there, and, the good old boy network, Now the good old boy network is going to have a federal arm to it. And that's going to be the new Department of Justice in a nutshell. That's all I got.